If you found yourself here tonight, welcome. Maybe you've had one of those days. Long, busy, full of noise you didn't ask for. Or maybe today was quieter, but your mind is still holding on to too many thoughts. Perhaps you're a student, still carrying the weight of things to remember. Or maybe you're just lying there, hoping sleep will finally find you. Whatever brought you here, I'm really glad you came. You don't need to do anything right now. No pressure, no tasks. Just let your hands rest. Let your breath slow down, and allow yourself to simply be here. You stir safe now, and you stir not alone. My only job tonight is to keep you company, to speak softly, to guide your thoughts far away from the noise of today, and into a story from long, long ago. Tonight we sail back to the 1730s, to the warm, sunlit waters of the Caribbean, a time when ships moved slowly across vast oceans, and when personal insults could, somehow, shape the destiny of entire empires. This is the tale of the War of Jenkins Ear. Yes, a real war, sparked by a severed ear. It all began with a British sea captain, a Spanish coast guard, and a moment of violence that, for reasons no one could have predicted, would echo all the way into the halls of British Parliament. The ear was cut off, preserved, and years later, displayed as evidence for war. It may sound absurd, but sometimes, the strange things we do reveal more about power, pride, and fear than any grand strategy ever could. So lie back, let the waves of history carry you, and allow your mind to drift through the sails and shadows of an empire in motion. And if this story brings you even a small moment of peace, if these quiet journeys through forgotten history help you sleep, feel free to leave a like or subscribe. That way, I can keep you company again tomorrow night, with another soft-spoken passage through time. Chapter 1. A Captain's Gruesome Trophy. The year was 1731, and the Caribbean Sea stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, whose rays beat down with an intensity that could drive men to madness and ships to ruin. The azure waters that had once seemed like paradise to conquistadors and adventurers now served as the stage for a bitter struggle between empires, each determined to control the vast wealth that flowed from the New World to Europe. Imagine yourself aboard one such vessel, caught in this imperial web, the Rebecca, as she navigated these contested waters, where Spanish and British claims overlapped like shadows at twilight, where every sail on the horizon might herald either opportunity or disaster. The Caribbean of 1731 was a realm unto itself, governed by different laws and customs than those that held sway in the drawing rooms of London or the courts of Madrid. Here, where the trade winds carried both fortune and fever, where pirates still haunted forgotten coves, and Spanish treasure ships sailed routes established by centuries of colonial exploitation, the abstract policies of distant monarchs became matters of life and death for those who dared to venture into these tropical waters in search of profit. Captain Robert Jenkins stood on his quarterdeck, a weathered man whose face bore the permanent squint of someone who had spent decades reading wind patterns and weather signs, interpreting the subtle messages that sea and sky sent to those wise enough to understand their language. His hands, scarred by rope burns and darkened by tropical sun, gripped the rail with the unconscious familiarity of one for whom the deck of a ship had become more natural than solid ground. The Rebecca was a typical merchant vessel of its time, her lines reflecting the compromise between speed and cargo capacity that defined successful commercial vessels in an age when profits were measured against the constant risk of loss to storm, piracy, or the arbitrary enforcement of competing imperial claims. Her hold was filled with goods from the American colonies, tobacco from Virginia, sugar from Jamaica, and countless other products that represented the growing wealth of Britain's New World Empire, while her destination lay in the profitable markets of Europe, where colonial goods commanded prices that could make fortunes or break hearts depending on the vagaries of supply, demand, and safe passage. Jenkins himself was representative of a new breed of maritime entrepreneur, men who had learned to navigate not only the physical dangers of ocean travel, but also the complex web of imperial regulations, trade restrictions, and diplomatic tensions that made commerce in the Atlantic world as much a political act as an economic one. His cabin contained not only the usual charts and navigation instruments, but also copies of treaties, trade agreements, and legal documents that might mean the difference between legitimate commerce and criminal smuggling depending on which authority happened to encounter his vessel. But these waters held dangers that went far beyond the natural hazards of storms and pirates that had always threatened maritime commerce. The political tensions between Britain and Spain had created an environment where merchant vessels like the Rebecca operated in a legal grey area that could be interpreted differently by different authorities, where the same cargo might be considered legitimate trade by one imperial power and criminal smuggling by another. The Spanish Coast Guard operated with the authority of their crown, patrolling these tropical seas with a zealousness that reflected centuries of colonial rivalry and economic competition. Their vessels, the Guarda Costas, carried commissions that granted them broad powers to search, seize and punish those they deemed to be violating Spain's carefully guarded monopoly over New World trade. To the Spanish authorities, British merchants like Jenkins were little more than smugglers, their ships floating violations of the sacred principle that had governed Spanish colonial policy since the days of Columbus and Cortés. The Spanish Empire's approach to colonial trade was based on the mercantilist principle that the wealth of the New World should flow exclusively to Spain, enriching the mother country while denying economic benefits to her European rivals. This system, known as the floater system, required that all trade with Spanish colonies be conducted through Spanish merchants using Spanish ships, creating a monopoly that the Spanish crown was prepared to defend with force when necessary. The British, however, had developed their own perspective on Caribbean commerce, one that emphasized the rights of free navigation and legitimate trade. British merchants argued that they were engaged in lawful commerce with British colonies and that Spanish attempts to restrict their movements constituted an intolerable interference with British sovereignty. This fundamental disagreement about the nature of legitimate trade had created a situation where every commercial voyage carried the potential for international incident. On that fateful day in April 1731, as the trade winds filled the Rebecca's sails and pushed her steadily through the warm waters of the Caribbean, Jenkins would have first spotted the Spanish vessel as a distant speck on the horizon, a dark smudge against the brilliant blue sky that could mean anything from a fellow merchant to a heavily armed warship. The years had taught him to read such signs with the skill of a meteorologist interpreting cloud formations, understanding that the approach of another vessel in these waters required careful evaluation and immediate preparation for multiple possibilities. Perhaps he felt the familiar knot of tension in his stomach. Every British captain who had sailed these waters knew that an encounter with the Guarda Costas could mean anything from a routine inspection that would delay their voyage by a few hours, to the confiscation of their entire cargo and the imprisonment of their crew. The Spanish ships patrolled these waters with the confidence of authority backed by imperial decree, their captains armed with legal documents that granted them sweeping powers over any vessel they deemed suspicious. The Spanish ship approached with the lazy confidence of predatory authority, her crew moving with the practiced efficiency of men who had performed this same ritual countless times before. Her captain, standing prominently on the quarterdeck, would have been studying the Rebecca through his telescope, evaluating her potential as both threat and prize. The Spanish vessel flew her colors proudly, the red and gold banner that proclaimed the authority of the Catholic kings and the divine mandate that supported Spanish dominion over these waters. As the distance between the vessels decreased, Jenkins would have been able to make out the details that marked his approaching visitors as representatives of Spanish naval authority. The ship herself was larger and more heavily armed than the Rebecca, her gun ports suggesting a capacity for violence that went far beyond what would be necessary for routine law enforcement. Her crew, visible now as individual figures moving about her deck, displayed the disciplined efficiency of professional sailors operating under military command. Imagine the sounds that would have filled the air as the Spanish vessel drew alongside the Rebecca, the groaning of rope and timber under strain, the splash of water against hulls as the two ships moved in the heavy swells, the sharp commands in Spanish that Jenkins may have understood all too well. The boarding party moved with military precision, their boots echoing on the Rebecca's deck as they spread out to search the ship from stem to stern, their movements coordinated by years of experience in conducting such inspections. The Spanish sailors who boarded the Rebecca were armed with cutlasses and pistols, their weapons displayed prominently as both practical tools and symbols of the authority they represented. Their uniforms, though showing the wear of tropical service, bore the marks of imperial authority that distinguished them from common pirates or privateers. These men served not only as law enforcement, but as the physical embodiment of Spanish sovereignty in waters that Spain considered her own by right of discovery and conquest. What exactly transpired next has been debated by historians for centuries. The details filtered through layers of political interpretation and imperial propaganda, but the basic facts remain as stark as they are disturbing. According to Jenkins' later testimony, delivered with the conviction of a man who had suffered for his words. The Spanish captain, a man whose name has been lost to history, but whose actions would reverberate through the corridors of power in London and Madrid, accused the British captain of smuggling, of violating the sacred principles that governed Spanish colonial trade. The accusation of smuggling was both serious and predictable, representing the standard charge that Spanish authorities leveled against British merchants operating in Caribbean waters. From the Spanish perspective, any British vessel trading in these waters was by definition engaged in illegal commerce, regardless of the specific nature of her cargo or the legitimacy of her papers. The very presence of a British merchant ship in waters that Spain considered her exclusive domain constituted a violation of international law, as Spain understood it. The search of the Rebecca's hold revealed evidence that the Spanish considered damning goods that, in their view, had been obtained through illegal trade with Spanish colonies, or that were being transported in violation of Spanish commercial law. The specific nature of this evidence has been lost to history, but it likely included items that could be interpreted as proof of unauthorized commerce, foreign manufactured goods intended for Spanish colonial markets, or colonial products that had been obtained through channels that bypassed Spanish control. The Spanish captain's reaction to this evidence was swift and decisive, reflecting both his authority under Spanish law and his personal interpretation of how such violations should be addressed. The Spanish legal system granted colonial officials broad discretionary powers in dealing with suspected smugglers, and the isolation of the Caribbean meant that such officials often operated without immediate oversight from higher authorities. In this context, the Spanish captain's actions, however brutal they may seem to modern sensibilities, operated within the framework of legitimate law enforcement as Spain understood it. The punishment that followed was swift and brutal, carried out with the efficiency of men who had performed similar acts before. Jenkins would later describe how the Spanish captain ordered his men to restrain the British crew, their struggles futile against the disciplined violence of the boarding party. The Caribbean sun beat down mercilessly as Jenkins was forced to his knees on his own deck, the familiar planks now slick with sweat and the spray of the restless sea, the solid wood that had supported him through countless voyages now serving as the platform for his humiliation. The physical restraint of Jenkins and his crew was accompanied by a psychological intimidation designed to emphasize Spanish authority and British helplessness. The Spanish sailors, acting under orders from their captain, demonstrated through their actions that British protests and appeals to international law carried no weight in waters controlled by Spanish power. The scene that unfolded on the Rebecca's deck was theatre as much as law enforcement, a carefully choreographed demonstration of imperial dominance. What happened next would echo through the ages, becoming one of those moments when personal suffering transforms into political symbol, when individual pain becomes the catalyst for collective action. The Spanish captain, perhaps seeking to make an example that would be remembered by other British merchants who might consider challenging Spanish authority in these waters, drew his cutlass, a weapon designed for the close quarters of naval combat, its curved blade optimized for the swift, devastating strikes that could decide boarding actions in seconds. The cutlass itself was more than a mere weapon. It was a symbol of naval authority and Spanish maritime power. Its steel had been forged in Spanish foundries, its edge honed by Spanish armorers, its handle worn smooth by Spanish hands. In drawing this blade, the Spanish captain was not merely threatening violence, but invoking the entire weight of Spanish imperial authority, the accumulated power of an empire that had ruled these waters for over 2 centuries. The blade caught the tropical light as it moved through the air, the polished steel reflecting the brilliant Caribbean sun in flashes that would have been visible to every man on both ships. The moment stretched with the terrible anticipation of irreversible action, time seeming to slow, as Jenkins faced the reality that his defiance of Spanish authority was about to exact a price that would mark him for the rest of his life. In one quick motion, executed with the practiced skill of a man accustomed to violence, Jenkins' left ear was severed from his head. The Spanish captain's blade moved with surgical precision, separating flesh from cartilage with a cut that was both decisive and deliberate. The choice of the ear as the target for this mutilation was not accidental. It represented a traditional form of punishment that marked the victim as a criminal, while allowing him to survive as a living testament to the consequences of challenging authority. The pain would have been immediate and shocking, a sensation that overwhelmed all other awareness as warm blood began flowing freely down Jenkins' neck and staining his shirt crimson. The human ear, with its complex network of nerve endings and blood vessels, produces an intense and unmistakable pain when severed, a sensation that Jenkins would carry with him for the rest of his life. But even as he fought to remain conscious through the waves of agony and shock, the Spanish captain was not finished with his grim theater. The blood that flowed from Jenkins' wound served multiple purposes in the Spanish captain's demonstration. It provided visual proof of Spanish power and determination, marking Jenkins as a man who had challenged Spanish authority and suffered the consequences. The crimson stain spreading across his shirt would remain visible for days, a constant reminder to his crew of what had transpired and what might happen to others who showed similar defiance. According to Jenkins' account, which he would later repeat before Parliament and in countless taverns throughout Britain, the Spanish officer held up the severed ear and delivered words that would be quoted in parliamentary debates and newspaper editorials for years to come. "Take this to your king and tell him that if he were here, I would serve him in the same manner." These words, whether accurately reported or embellished in the telling, encapsulated the Spanish position that their authority in Caribbean waters was absolute, and that even the British crown would be subject to Spanish justice if found violating Spanish law. The symbolic significance of this declaration cannot be overstated. By threatening to treat the British king in the same manner as a common smuggler, the Spanish captain was rejecting the diplomatic immunity and royal dignity that formed the foundation of international relations. His words constituted not merely a threat against Jenkins personally, but a challenge to the entire structure of British imperial authority and royal prerogative. The immediate aftermath of the mutilation required Jenkins and his crew to focus on practical medical concerns while processing the psychological impact of what had occurred. The ship's surgeon, if the Rebecca carried one, or the crew member with the most medical knowledge would have worked to clean and dress the wound, using techniques that were crude by modern standards but represented the best available treatment for traumatic injuries at sea. The constant motion of the ship, the tropical heat, and the limited sanitary conditions aboard an 18th century merchant vessel all complicated the healing process. Here the story takes on an almost mythical quality, one that speaks to the strange priorities of the age and the complex relationship between personal suffering and political symbolism. Rather than simply disposing of the severed ear, or allowing it to be lost in the confusion of the moment, Jenkins, whether through shock, calculation, or some combination of both, made a decision that would prove historically significant. He retrieved his ear from the deck where it had fallen, and in an act that seems almost impossible to modern sensibilities, he made the deliberate choice to preserve it. The Spanish crew departed as quickly as they had arrived, their mission accomplished, and their point made. They left Jenkins and his men to tend to their captain's wound as best they could with the limited medical supplies available aboard a merchant vessel. The bleeding was eventually stanched through the application of pressure and crude bandages, the wound roughly treated with whatever antiseptics the ship's medicine chest could provide. But the ear itself, that small piece of flesh that would soon become one of history's most notorious artifacts, had been transformed from part of Jenkins' body into evidence of Spanish brutality. The decision to preserve the ear represented a transformation of personal trauma into political weapon, a recognition that the physical evidence of Spanish brutality might prove more powerful than any written account or verbal testimony. In an age when communication across oceans took months and official reports could be disputed or dismissed, Jenkins understood that he possessed something that could not be questioned or explained away. The ear was proof of Spanish brutality, a physical manifestation of what he would later describe as an insult to the British crown itself. The method of preservation has become part of the legend, with different accounts providing various details that reflect both the practical limitations of 18th century preservation techniques and the symbolic importance that the ear would later acquire. Some accounts suggest that Jenkins placed the ear in a jar of rum, alcohol being one of the few effective preservatives readily available aboard ship and commonly used for medical purposes in an era before modern antiseptics. The high alcohol content of naval rum would have prevented bacterial growth, while maintaining the ear's physical integrity over the months-long voyage back to Britain. Others claim he used pickle brine, taking advantage of the salt and acid content that made such solutions effective for food preservation. The ship's stores would have included pickled vegetables and meats, essential for long ocean voyages, and the brine from these containers could have served as an impromptu preservation medium. Still other versions of the story suggest he used salt water, recognizing that the high salinity of seawater could retard decomposition if the solution was kept sealed and undisturbed. Whatever the specific method employed, the ear was carefully stored away, transformed from a piece of human flesh into what would become a political weapon more powerful than any cannon. The act of preservation required Jenkins to handle his own severed body part, to make practical decisions about storage and maintenance, while dealing with the physical and emotional trauma of mutilation. This process would have been deeply disturbing on a personal level, while simultaneously serving as a constant reminder of his determination to see justice done. As the Rebecca continued her journey through the Caribbean waters, Jenkins had ample time to contemplate what had happened to him, and to begin formulating his response to Spanish aggression. The steady rhythm of the ship cutting through the waves would have provided a constant reminder of his ordeal, each movement of his head sending sharp pains through his damaged skull, while the healing wound served as a physical memorial to Spanish brutality. The tropical heat and humidity that characterized Caribbean voyages would have made the healing process slow and uncomfortable, with the constant threat of infection requiring careful attention to the wound's condition. But perhaps more significant than the physical pain was the psychological impact of what he had endured, the recognition that he had been mutilated, not just as an individual merchant seeking profit, but as a representative of British commerce, and by extension, British sovereignty itself. The Spanish captain's words, threatening to treat the British king in the same manner, had transformed Jenkins' personal suffering into a symbol of national humiliation that demanded response from the highest levels of government. The preservation of the ear was not merely a macabre souvenir of a traumatic encounter. It was evidence that could not be disputed or dismissed by skeptical officials who might question verbal accounts of Spanish brutality. In an age when international disputes often turned on questions of evidence and credibility, when diplomatic correspondence could take months to traverse the Atlantic and official investigations could be influenced by political considerations, Jenkins possessed something that spoke with undeniable clarity about the nature of Spanish colonial policy. The jar containing the ear became Jenkins' constant companion during the remaining weeks of his voyage, a grotesque reminder of Spanish authority and British humiliation that he would later claim to have carried with him always. The physical presence of the preserved ear served multiple psychological functions, reinforcing his determination to seek justice while providing tangible proof of his sufferings that could convince even the most skeptical observers of the truth of his account. As the Rebecca sailed on through the Caribbean waters, navigating the complex currents and weather patterns that governed travel in these tropical seas, Jenkins began to formulate what would become one of the most effective pieces of political theatre in British history. The jar containing his ear became more than a memorial to personal suffering. It was transformed into a portable symbol of the price of challenging Spanish dominance in the New World, a physical manifestation of the tensions that had been building between the two empires for decades. The weeks that followed his mutilation would have been difficult ones for Jenkins, both physically and emotionally. The wound healed slowly in the tropical heat, the constant dampness of life at sea creating ideal conditions for infection and complicating the recovery process. The tropical climate that made the Caribbean a paradise for some proved hostile to healing wounds, as the high humidity and temperature created an environment where bacteria could flourish and minor injuries could become life-threatening infections. The psychological challenges of recovery were equally daunting. Jenkins had to adapt to the loss of his ear while maintaining his authority as captain and his ability to navigate the ship safely to port. The visible evidence of his mutilation would have been a constant reminder to his crew of their own vulnerability to Spanish violence, creating an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty that could have undermined morale and discipline during the long voyage home. But Jenkins survived, his constitution apparently strong enough to overcome both the physical trauma of his injury and the psychological pressure of commanding a ship, while bearing visible evidence of his encounter with Spanish authority. With each passing day, as the wound healed and his strength returned, his resolve to see justice done grew stronger. The pain that had initially overwhelmed all other considerations gradually gave way to a burning determination to ensure that his suffering would not be meaningless, that Spanish brutality would face consequences commensurate with its severity. He began to craft the story he would tell upon his return to Britain, polishing the details until they gleamed like the surface of the Caribbean Sea under the noonday sun. The account he would later provide to Parliament and to countless audiences throughout Britain would be both factually accurate and dramatically effective, combining the stark reality of his mutilation with a narrative structure that emphasized the broader implications of Spanish policy for British commerce and national honor. In the quiet moments between watches, as the Rebecca rolled gently through the swells that characterized the Caribbean's endless motion, Jenkins would have had ample time to consider the implications of his ordeal. The solitude of command provided opportunities for reflection that were rare in the demanding routine of ship management. moments when he could process the full significance of what had occurred and begin to understand how his personal tragedy might serve larger political purposes. He was no longer simply a merchant captain seeking profit in the New World. He had become a symbol of British suffering at Spanish hands, a living testament to the price of Spanish colonial policy. The ear in its jar represented more than personal injury. It was a condensed embodiment of the tensions that had been building between the two empires for decades. A physical manifestation of the conflicts that arose when competing imperial systems collided in the vast spaces of the Atlantic world. The transformation of Jenkins from merchant to symbol was not merely personal but reflected broader changes in the relationship between individual experience and national policy that characterized the 18th century. His story would resonate with British audiences because it combined personal suffering with larger questions of national honor and imperial competition, creating a narrative that was both intimately human and broadly political. The Caribbean continued its eternal dance around the ship, indifferent to human suffering, but forever changed by the events that had transpired in its waters. The sea that had witnessed centuries of imperial competition, from the Spanish conquest of indigenous peoples to the ongoing struggles between European powers for control of colonial wealth, had added another chapter to its long history of violence and exploitation. The waves that had carried conquistadors and pirates, treasure ships and slave vessels, now bore the Rebecca toward a destiny that would transform personal trauma into international conflict. As the Rebecca sailed toward home, she carried with her a cargo more valuable than any goods in her hold, a story that would ignite the imagination of a nation and set in motion events that would cost thousands of lives. The preserved ear, carefully tended and jealously guarded, represented potential energy that would soon be converted into kinetic force, transforming Jenkins' individual suffering into collective action that would reshape the political landscape of Europe and the Americas. The gentle rhythm of the waves against the hull seemed to whisper of the violence that had been done, and of the greater violence that was yet to come. In the warm darkness of the tropical night, with only the stars as witnesses to his solitary vigil, Jenkins tended to his wound and guarded his terrible treasure, knowing that his moment of suffering would soon become a rallying cry for war. The ear in its jar represented not only what had been lost but what might yet be gained, not only Spanish brutality, but British determination to exact a price for such treatment of their subjects. As the Caribbean stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, unchanged by human conflict, but bearing witness to human suffering, Jenkins prepared for a role he had never sought but could not avoid. The merchant captain who had left Britain seeking nothing more than honest profit was returning as something far more significant, a symbol of national humiliation that demanded redress, a living embodiment of Spanish arrogance that could no longer be tolerated. His ear, preserved in its jar like a religious relic, would soon become one of the most powerful political weapons in British history, proof that even the smallest acts of violence could have consequences that echoed across continents and through generations. Chapter 2. Outrage in Britain. 7 years passed, like the turning of seasons, each one carrying Captain Jenkins further from that brutal day in the Caribbean, yet never allowing him to forget it, or to escape the constant reminder of Spanish cruelty that marked his very appearance. The year was now 1738, and London had grown into a sprawling metropolis of nearly 750,000 souls, its narrow medieval streets straining to contain a population that had swelled beyond all previous imagination, as commerce and empire drew people from across the British Isles and beyond. The city had become a maze of contradictions, where elegant Georgian squares housing the wealthy stood mere blocks from fetid slums, where the poor struggled for survival, where the latest philosophical treatises were debated in coffee houses, while beggars died in doorways just outside. Imagine yourself walking through these crowded thoroughfares, where the scent of roasting meat from prosperous taverns mingled with the less pleasant odors of a city, still learning to manage its own explosive growth, the stench of open sewers, the acrid smoke from thousands of coal fires, and the omnipresent smell of horses that provided the city's primary means of transportation. London in 1738 was the beating heart of an empire that stretched across oceans, a commercial centre where fortunes were made and lost on news that arrived by ship from distant corners of the world. The Thames, brown and sluggish as it wound through the city, carried vessels from every maritime nation, their holds filled with exotic goods that spoke of British reach and ambition. Yet this prosperity was built upon an increasingly unstable foundation of imperial competition and commercial rivalry that threatened to collapse into violence at any moment. It was in this bustling metropolis, where political intrigue and commercial ambition intersected with deadly efficiency, that Jenkins would finally have his moment of reckoning. The preserved ear, now 7 years old and somewhat clouded by time but no less recognizable for its age, had become as much a part of his identity as his weathered face or his distinctive sailor's gait. Through all those intervening years he had carried it with him, not merely as a personal reminder of Spanish cruelty, but as a weapon waiting for the right moment to be deployed in the service of a cause larger than his individual suffering. The jar itself had become an object of almost religious significance to Jenkins, a reliquary containing not the remains of a saint, but evidence of secular martyrdom that demanded temporal rather than spiritual justice. He had shown it to select audiences over the years, using its shocking contents to punctuate his accounts of Spanish brutality and to demonstrate the reality of threats that British merchants faced in Caribbean waters. Each viewing had reinforced his determination to see justice done, while also refining his understanding of the ear's political potential. The political climate of Britain in 1738 was as turbulent as the seas Jenkins knew so well, characterized by tensions that had been building for decades, between competing visions of national policy and imperial strategy. Sir Robert Walpole, the King's chief minister, and the man who had dominated British politics for nearly 2 decades, had maintained an uneasy peace with Spain through a combination of diplomatic skill and strategic restraint. His policy of avoiding expensive foreign entanglements had allowed Britain to consolidate her colonial gains and develop her commercial advantages without the devastating costs of major European warfare. But that peace was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain as pressures mounted from multiple directions. British merchants, emboldened by their growing wealth and frustrated by Spanish restrictions on trade, chafed under the limitations that colonial monopolies placed upon their ambitions. They argued that Spanish authorities were systematically excluding British commerce from markets that should be open to free trade, while Spanish officials grew ever more aggressive in their enforcement of colonial monopolies that they viewed as essential to their empire's survival. The two empires circled each other like wary predators, each incident in the Caribbean adding another layer of resentment to their already strained relationship. Spanish coastguards continued to search British vessels with what the British considered excessive zeal, while British merchants continued to probe the boundaries of Spanish colonial law with what the Spanish viewed as criminal intent. Every seizure of a British ship, every detention of British sailors, every fine imposed by Spanish courts became another grievance in a growing catalogue of mutual antagonism. Opposition politicians, led by figures like William Pitt the Elder, sensed opportunity in the growing tensions between commercial ambition and diplomatic restraint. They had long argued that Walpole's Pacific policies were a betrayal of British interests, that the nation's merchants were being systematically humiliated by Spanish arrogance, while the government stood by in passive acquiescence. They contended that peace purchased at the price of national dignity was no peace at all, but rather a form of disguised defeat that encouraged further Spanish aggression. What the opposition needed was a symbol, a human face to place on the abstract concept of British grievance that could transform policy debates into emotional appeals. They required something that could move public opinion beyond the narrow circles of merchants and politicians to encompass the broader population, whose support would be necessary for any major shift in national policy. Captain Jenkins, with his missing ear and his jar of preserved flesh, would prove to be exactly what they required. A perfect synthesis of personal suffering and national humiliation that could serve their political purposes with devastating effectiveness. The House of Commons in 1738 was a place of theatrical politics, where oratory could indeed move mountains and the right story, told at the right moment by the right person, could change the course of history in ways that mere logical argument could never achieve. The chamber itself reflected the accumulated weight of centuries of British political tradition, its wooden benches scarred by generations of passionate debate, its walls witnesses to the rise and fall of ministries, the declaration of wars, and the negotiation of peace treaties that had shaped the destiny of nations. Imagine yourself in the gallery of that august chamber, looking down at the wooden benches where the most powerful men in the British Empire gathered to debate the fate of nations and the future of millions of people whose lives would be affected by their decisions. The room would have been thick with tobacco smoke from the pipes that members routinely smoked during debates, the air heavy with the musty scent of old wood, and the accumulated breath of countless speakers who had addressed the assembly over the centuries. The physical environment of the Commons reflected the social hierarchies that governed British political life, with government supporters arranged on one side of the chamber and opposition members on the other, their spatial separation emphasising the adversarial nature of parliamentary politics. The Speaker's chair, elevated above the common benches, served as both a symbol of parliamentary authority and a practical necessity for maintaining order among men whose passions often exceeded their discretion. The moment had finally come for his 7-year-old grievance to find its voice in the highest councils of government, for his personal suffering to be transformed into political action. Jenkins entered the chamber with the careful dignity of a man who understood that his personal suffering was about to become a matter of national importance, that his individual experience would soon be subjected to the kind of scrutiny that could either validate his claims or destroy his credibility forever. The committee members, drawn from both government and opposition ranks, listened with growing fascination as Jenkins recounted the events of that April day in 1731. His voice, roughened by decades of shouting orders across windswept decks, and weathered by years of exposure to salt air and tropical sun, carried easily through the chamber as he described the Spanish boarding party, the accusation of smuggling, and the swift, brutal punishment that had followed his refusal to accept Spanish authority. Jenkins' testimony was carefully crafted to emphasize not only the personal injustice he had suffered, but also the broader implications of Spanish policy for British commerce and national honor. He spoke of the systematic nature of Spanish harassment of British merchants, the arbitrary enforcement of colonial monopolies, and the contemptuous attitude that Spanish officials displayed toward British claims of legitimate trade. His account painted a picture of Spanish arrogance and British humiliation that resonated powerfully with his parliamentary audience. But it was not his words alone that would capture the imagination of Parliament, and soon after, the entire nation. Jenkins understood instinctively that political theatre required more than mere verbal testimony, that the most powerful political messages combined emotional appeal with visual impact. The preserved ear represented the perfect fusion of these elements, a physical artifact that could speak more eloquently than any speech about the reality of Spanish brutality and the price of British weakness. With the practiced timing of a man who had told this story many times before, to audiences ranging from tavern crowds to merchant associations, Jenkins reached into his coat and withdrew a small glass jar, whose contents would soon become the most famous political artifact in British history. The liquid inside had grown somewhat cloudy over the years, the preservative solution taking on a yellowish cast that spoke of time's passage, but its contents remained unmistakably recognizable to anyone with the courage to look closely. There, floating in its preservative solution like some grotesque biological specimen, was the ear that had been severed from his head 7 years earlier, a piece of human flesh that had somehow survived to become a political artifact of immense power. The ear itself appeared almost peaceful in its liquid suspension, its familiar curves and contours rendered strange and disturbing by the context of its preservation and display. The effect on the assembled politicians was immediate and profound, creating a moment of stunned silence that spoke more eloquently than any verbal response could have managed. Here was no abstract discussion of trade policy or diplomatic protocol, no theoretical debate about the proper interpretation of international law or commercial agreements. Here was tangible evidence of Spanish brutality, a physical manifestation of the insults that British merchants had endured in the Caribbean, proof that could not be dismissed or explained away by clever diplomatic language. The ear seemed to speak louder than any speech, its mute testimony more compelling than volumes of diplomatic correspondence or commercial statistics. It transformed the parliamentary chamber into something approaching a courtroom, with Jenkins serving as both witness and evidence, his mutilated body bearing testimony to Spanish crimes that demanded justice. The visual impact of the preserved ear created an emotional response that transcended political party lines and commercial interests to touch something more fundamental about national pride and human dignity. According to the accounts that have survived from witnesses present in the chamber, Jenkins held the jar aloft with the solemnity of a priest, displaying a sacred relic, and spoke words that would echo through British history for generations to come. "I committed my soul to God and my cause to my country." The simple dignity of the statement, combined with the grotesque evidence he displayed, created a moment of political theatre that opposition politicians would exploit to devastating effect in the months that followed. The words themselves were carefully chosen to emphasize Jenkins' dual role as both individual victim and national symbol, suggesting that his personal suffering had been transformed into a sacred trust that the nation was morally obligated to honor. By invoking both divine authority and patriotic duty, Jenkins created a framework that made opposition to his cause appear not merely politically unwise but morally indefensible. The story of Jenkins Ear spread through London, with the speed of wildfire through dry timber, carried by the informal networks of political gossip, commercial correspondence, and social interaction that bound the city's diverse population together. The tale had all the elements necessary to capture public imagination: personal drama, national humiliation, foreign brutality, and the promise of righteous vengeance that could restore both individual justice and collective honor. Coffee houses throughout the city buzzed with discussions of Spanish cruelty, their patrons debating the implications of Jenkins' testimony while consuming the exotic beverages that symbolized Britain's growing commercial reach. These establishments served as crucial centers of political discourse, where men from different social classes and professional backgrounds could gather to discuss the events of the day while forming the public opinion that would ultimately determine government policy. The coffeehouse culture of 18th century London provided an ideal environment for the Jenkins story to flourish and evolve. In these smoky, bustling establishments, news and rumor mingled freely, creating a dynamic information environment where stories could be embellished, analyzed, and transformed in ways that enhanced their political impact. The democratic nature of coffeehouse discourse meant that Jenkins' tale reached audiences far beyond the narrow circles of parliamentary politics to engage the attention of merchants, craftsmen, clerks, and other ordinary citizens whose support would be crucial for any shift in national policy. Newspapers throughout the kingdom printed increasingly inflammatory accounts of the captain's ordeal, their editors recognizing the commercial potential of a story that combined human drama with political controversy. The press of 1738, while still constrained by various legal and political limitations, had developed sufficient independence to serve as an effective vehicle for opposition propaganda. Publications like the London Magazine and the Gentleman's Magazine competed to provide the most compelling accounts of Jenkins' suffering, while drawing increasingly explicit connections between his personal tragedy and the broader failures of government policy. The British public, already suspicious of Spanish intentions in the New World, and frustrated by what they perceived as excessive government caution in defending national interests, found in Jenkins' story a focus for their broader anxieties about national honor and commercial competition. The year became a symbol that transcended its immediate context to represent everything that was wrong with Britain's relationship with Spain and everything that needed to be corrected through decisive action. William Pitt the Elder, one of the most gifted orators of his generation, and a master of the kind of passionate rhetoric that could transform political debate into emotional crusade, seized upon the Jenkins affair with the instincts of a born politician who understood how personal stories could be transformed into national causes. In speech after speech delivered both in Parliament and at public gatherings throughout the kingdom, he transformed the captain's personal injury into a symbol of British humiliation that demanded immediate redress. "The Spanish coast guards have torn the British flag from our ships," he thundered in one particularly memorable address, "and mutilated the bodies of our citizens. How long shall we endure such insults to our national honor? How long shall British merchants suffer under the arbitrary authority of Spanish despots? How long shall the sons of Britain carry the scars of foreign brutality while their government debates the niceties of diplomatic protocol?" Pitt's rhetorical genius lay in his ability to connect individual suffering with collective identity, to transform Jenkins' personal tragedy into a test of national character that could not be failed without permanent damage to British prestige and commercial interests. His speeches elevated the ear from a piece of preserved flesh into a sacred relic that embodied everything that made Britain great and everything that threatened to destroy her greatness if left unaddressed. The opposition press, led by publications like The Craftsman and energized by the political potential of the Jenkins story, amplified these themes with headlines that grew more provocative with each passing day. "British captain mutilated by Spanish savages," screamed one typical headline, while another asked in bold type, "Will Britain allow her sons to be butchered by foreign despots?" The ear became a recurring symbol in political cartoons and satirical prints, often depicted as a martyred victim crying out for justice or as evidence of government weakness that invited further foreign aggression. The visual propaganda surrounding the Jenkins case reflected the growing sophistication of British political culture and the increasing importance of public opinion in determining government policy. Artists and printmakers throughout London produced images that transformed the ear into a powerful political symbol, while depicting Spanish authorities as cruel tyrants and British officials as weak appeasers who had failed in their fundamental duty to protect their fellow citizens. Public opinion, always volatile in the London of the 1730s, but now inflamed by skillful propaganda and genuine outrage, began to shift decisively toward war with a speed that alarmed even some of those who had initiated the campaign. Merchants who had long suffered under Spanish restrictions on trade saw in Jenkins' story a vindication of their complaints and an opportunity to force government action that might open new markets for British goods. The common people, many of whom had little direct stake in Caribbean commerce, but possessed strong feelings about national honor and individual justice, found themselves stirred by the simple human drama of a British subject brutalized by foreign authority. The psychological impact of Jenkins' story on British public opinion cannot be overstated. In an age when national identity was still being formed, and when the boundaries between personal and political loyalty remained fluid, the image of a British citizen suffering mutilation at foreign hands struck at fundamental assumptions about the protection that nationality should provide. The ear became a symbol not only of Spanish cruelty, but of the vulnerability that all British subjects might face if their government failed to defend them adequately. The pressure on Walpole's government grew daily as petitions poured in from trading centres across the kingdom, demanding action against Spanish aggression. These documents, signed by thousands of merchants, craftsmen and ordinary citizens, represented an unprecedented mobilization of public opinion around foreign policy issues that had previously been considered the exclusive domain of professional diplomats and government officials. Members of Parliament found themselves lobbied by constituents who had never before shown interest in foreign affairs, but were now united in their outrage over Jenkins' treatment. The geographical spread of anti-Spanish sentiment demonstrated the effectiveness of the Jenkins campaign in transcending regional and class boundaries to create a truly national movement. From the ports of Bristol and Liverpool, where merchants had direct experience with Spanish interference in Caribbean trade, to the manufacturing towns of the Midlands, where workers produced goods for colonial markets, the call for action against Spain resonated with increasing power. Walpole himself, a cautious man who had built his career on avoiding expensive foreign entanglements, and who understood better than most the true costs of military action, watched with growing alarm as the political situation deteriorated around him. He recognized that war with Spain would be costly in both blood and treasure. That victory was far from certain given Spanish naval strength and colonial resources, and that the consequences of failure could be catastrophic for British interests around the world. The Prime Minister's position was made more difficult by his accurate understanding of the broader European situation, where war between Britain and Spain could easily escalate into a general conflict involving France and other major powers. His diplomatic experience had taught him that local colonial disputes could rapidly expand into continental wars that would drain British resources and threaten the stability of the European balance of power that had been so carefully constructed through decades of negotiation. But Walpole also understood that political survival sometimes required actions that went against one's better judgment, that the dynamics of public opinion and parliamentary pressure could force governments into policies that professional wisdom would reject. The Jenkins case had created a political momentum that was becoming increasingly difficult to resist, regardless of the military and diplomatic risks that war with Spain would entail. The captain's ear had become something more than a piece of preserved flesh. It had transformed into a symbol of British resolve, a test of the nation's willingness to defend its honour against foreign insult. In the smoky atmosphere of London's political clubs, where gentlemen gathered to discuss the affairs of the day over brandy and tobacco, men who had never smelled gunpowder or felt the roll of a ship's deck debated the merits of war with the passion of seasoned warriors. The social dynamics of the Jenkins campaign reflected the complex class structure of 18th century Britain, where aristocratic opposition leaders, wealthy merchants and common citizens found temporary unity around a cause that transcended their usual political divisions. The ear had become a symbol that could appeal simultaneously to aristocratic concepts of honour, merchant concerns about commercial freedom, and popular feelings about national dignity. As spring turned to summer in 1738, the momentum toward conflict became increasingly difficult to resist, with each passing week bringing new demonstrations of public support for military action against Spain. Jenkins himself, perhaps overwhelmed by the magnitude of what his testimony had unleashed, and possibly concerned about the personal consequences of his growing fame, retreated somewhat from the public eye. But his ear remained a potent political weapon. its image reproduced in countless pamphlets and broadsides that circulated throughout the kingdom like propaganda leaflets in a modern political campaign. The captain's withdrawal from public attention did nothing to diminish the political power of his story, which had taken on a life of its own independent of his personal involvement. Opposition politicians continued to invoke his name and display images of his ear as they pressed their case for war, while government supporters found themselves increasingly unable to defend a policy of restraint in the face of such compelling evidence of Spanish brutality. The Spanish government, watching events in Britain with growing concern and alarm, attempted to defuse the situation through traditional diplomatic channels, offering explanations and apologies that might have been sufficient in normal circumstances. But their efforts were hampered by the very nature of the Jenkins affair. How could they effectively apologize for an incident that had occurred 7 years earlier, involving officials whose actions they could neither confirm nor deny with certainty? The Spanish response also suffered from fundamental misunderstanding of British political culture and the role that public opinion played in determining government policy. Spanish officials, accustomed to a more centralized system where policy was determined by royal decree rather than popular pressure, failed to appreciate the degree to which the Jenkins case had transformed Anglo-Spanish relations from a diplomatic issue into a domestic political crisis that could not be resolved through conventional negotiation. The ear had become an accusation that could not be easily answered or explained away through diplomatic language, a piece of evidence that spoke more powerfully than any official document or formal protest. Its very existence constituted an indictment of Spanish colonial policy that demanded response rather than explanation, action rather than apology. By the autumn of 1738, the political pressure had become irresistible, with public opinion decisively favouring war and parliamentary opposition to government policy reaching crisis proportions. Walpole, recognising that his position was becoming untenable and that continued resistance to popular demands might cost him not only his office but also the stability of the entire political system, began to prepare for what he had spent his career trying to avoid. The wheels of war were beginning to turn, set in motion by a captain's testimony and a jar containing a piece of human flesh that had somehow survived to become one of the most influential political artifacts in British history. The transformation of Jenkins' ear from personal memento to national symbol represented a triumph of political theatre over diplomatic restraint, of emotional appeal over rational calculation. As the year drew to a close, Jenkins' ear had achieved something that no amount of diplomatic protest or commercial negotiation had been able to accomplish. It had transformed a distant colonial dispute into a matter of national honour, a personal injury into a casus belli that would soon drench the Caribbean in blood and extend British influence across the globe. The gentle rhythm of political discourse had given way to the drumbeat of approaching conflict, and all because of a moment of brutality preserved in a jar of rum. The captain's ordeal was finally about to receive its answer, though that answer would come at a price in human life and national treasure that few could have imagined when Jenkins first displayed his grotesque trophy to the assembled politicians of Parliament. The ear had spoken with a voice more powerful than any orator, and nations would now pay the cost of listening to its silent but compelling testimony. In the counting houses of London and the naval yards of Portsmouth, in the colonial assemblies of America, and the Spanish strongholds of the Caribbean, men began to prepare for a war that would reshape the balance of power in the Atlantic world and determine the future of empire for generations to come. Chapter 3. Battle in the Caribbean. The declaration of war came on October 23, 1739, delivered with all the formal ceremony that befitted such a momentous decision, as King George II, speaking through his ministers in the ornate chambers of Westminster, announced that Britain could no longer tolerate Spanish depredations against British commerce and subjects. The carefully crafted language of the declaration invoked principles of international law and national honour, but beneath the diplomatic formalities lay the raw emotion that Captain Jenkins' preserved ear had unleashed upon British public opinion. The immediate cause cited was the treatment of Captain Jenkins, but the deeper currents that had brought the two empires to this point ran far beneath the surface of that single incident, encompassing decades of commercial rivalry, territorial disputes, and the fundamental incompatibility between British ambitions for free trade and Spanish determination to maintain colonial monopolies. The war that was about to unfold would test both empires in ways that neither government had fully anticipated, transforming what many expected to be a brief colonial skirmish into a prolonged struggle that would reshape the balance of power in the Atlantic world. Imagine yourself standing on the docks of Portsmouth, or Plymouth, on that grey autumn day, watching as the Royal Navy prepared for what would become known to history as the War of Jenkins Ear. The great naval yards buzzed with activity as centuries of accumulated maritime expertise was mobilized for war, the sound of hammers and saws echoing across the water as ships were fitted out for tropical service, and their crews prepared for campaigns in waters far from home. The great ships of the line, their hulls black with tar, and their masts, reaching toward the grey English sky like cathedral spires, represented the accumulated power of centuries of maritime tradition and technological innovation. These vessels, some carrying as many as 100 guns, were the most sophisticated weapons of war that human ingenuity had yet devised, floating fortresses capable of projecting British power to the farthest corners of the globe. These magnificent warships would soon carry British ambitions across the Atlantic, their holds filled with powder and shot, their decks crowded with men who would fight and die for causes they barely understood. The sailors who manned these vessels represented every corner of the British Isles and beyond. English farm boys seeking adventure, Scottish Highlanders fleeing poverty, Irish rebels impressed into service, and foreign volunteers drawn by the promise of prize money and glory. The logistics of preparing such an expedition were staggering in their complexity. Ships had to be provisioned not just with food and water for the voyage, but with the specialized equipment needed for tropical warfare. Medical supplies were loaded to combat diseases that British physicians barely understood, while spare sails and rigging were carefully stowed to replace materials that would rot quickly in the Caribbean humidity. The command of the Caribbean expedition fell to Admiral Edward Vernon, a man whose reputation for aggressive action and tactical brilliance had earned him the affectionate nickname Old Grog among his sailors, a reference to the waterproof grogram cloak he habitually wore in foul weather. Vernon embodied the spirit of the age, supremely confident in British naval superiority, openly contemptuous of Spanish military capabilities, and utterly convinced that a few decisive victories would bring Madrid to its knees and vindicate the decision to go to war over a merchant captain's severed ear. Vernon's career had been built upon a series of successful actions against French and Spanish forces during previous conflicts, experiences that had taught him to combine tactical innovation with aggressive leadership. His sailors trusted him implicitly, knowing that he shared their dangers and understood their needs in ways that many aristocratic officers did not. His reputation for caring for his men's welfare had earned him a loyalty that would prove crucial in the challenging campaigns ahead. His flagship, the HMS Burford, a 70-gun ship of the line that represented the pinnacle of British naval architecture, became the floating headquarters for what the British hoped would be a swift and profitable campaign. The ship's great cabin, where Vernon would plan his operations and receive intelligence about Spanish movements, was fitted out with maps of the Caribbean and copies of captured Spanish documents that detailed the defenses of key strongholds. The first target chosen by the British Admiralty was the Spanish fortress of Portobello, located on the Caribbean coast of what is now Panama. This ancient city, founded by the Spanish in the 16th century as a key link in their imperial trade network, had grown rich on the silver trade that flowed from the mines of Peru to the markets of Europe. Its massive stone fortifications, built over generations to withstand both pirate raids and foreign invasions, represented the physical manifestation of Spanish power and determination in the New World. Portobello's strategic importance extended far beyond its impressive fortifications. The city served as the terminus for one of the most valuable trade routes in the Spanish Empire, where treasure ships from the Pacific loaded the silver and gold that financed Spanish power in Europe. The annual treasure fair held in the city attracted merchants from across the Spanish colonies, creating a concentration of wealth that had made Portobello a target for enemies of Spain for over 2 centuries. Portobello in 1739 was a city that breathed with the rhythm of empire, its streets filled with the cosmopolitan mixture of peoples that characterized major colonial centers. Imagine yourself walking through its narrow streets in the months before Vernon's arrival, past houses built in the distinctive Spanish colonial style, their thick walls designed to keep out both the oppressive tropical heat and the ever-present threat of attack by pirates or foreign enemies. The architecture of the city reflected centuries of Spanish colonial experience, with buildings that combined European design principles with adaptations to local climate and materials. Coral stone, quarried from the nearby reefs, provided the primary building material, while red tile roofs and wooden shutters offered protection from both sun and rain. The narrow streets were laid out according to Spanish colonial planning principles, creating shaded areas where residents could escape the brutal midday heat. The air would have been heavy with the scent of exotic spices being prepared in countless kitchens, the salt tang of the Caribbean Sea, and the ever-present aroma of tropical flowers that bloomed in profusion despite the urban environment. The constant sound of construction echoed from the harbor where Spanish engineers worked frantically to strengthen the city's defenses, having received intelligence about British preparations for war, and understanding that Portobello would likely be among the first targets. The Spanish garrison at Portobello was commanded by officers who understood that their city represented more than mere military value. It was a symbol of Spanish dominance in the Caribbean, a demonstration that Madrid's authority extended to the farthest reaches of the empire. These men, many of them veterans of previous conflicts with British forces, Dutch raiders, and various pirate expeditions, prepared for the coming assault with the grim determination of soldiers who knew that defeat would mean more than personal disgrace. Don Dionisio de Alcedo, the Spanish governor of the region, had spent months strengthening Portobello's defenses, adding new gun batteries and improving the training of his garrison. His forces included regular Spanish troops, colonial militia, and indigenous auxiliaries, creating a diverse but determined defensive force that reflected the multicultural character of Spanish colonial society. Vernon's fleet appeared off Portobello on November 20th, 1739, like a forest of masts rising from the blue-green waters of the Caribbean, the white sails of the British ships creating a magnificent and terrifying spectacle that could be seen from miles away. The British ships moved with the practiced precision of the world's most powerful navy, their gun ports open and their crews ready for action. The admiral had chosen his moment carefully, arriving during the dry season when weather conditions would favor his operation, and when Spanish reinforcements would have difficulty reaching the city. The sight of the British fleet would have struck terror into the hearts of Portobello's defenders, who could count the enemy vessels and understand immediately that they were facing overwhelming odds. The Spanish lookouts who reported the fleet's approach must have felt something approaching despair as they realized the magnitude of the force arrayed against their city. The assault on Portobello began at dawn on November 21st, with the thunder of naval artillery rolling across the water like an approaching tropical storm. The British ships of the line moved into position with calculated precision, their heavy guns trained on the Spanish fortifications that had guarded the city for nearly 2 centuries. The sound of the cannonade would have been deafening, a constant roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth and could be heard for miles inland. The British gunners, among the most skilled in the world, worked their pieces with mechanical efficiency, loading and firing in sequences that had been drilled into them through countless hours of practice. The 24 and 32-pound cannonballs crashed into the Spanish fortifications with devastating effect, sending fragments of coral stone flying through the air and creating clouds of dust that obscured the battlefield. The Spanish defenders fought with desperate courage, their return fire creating clouds of black powder smoke that drifted across the harbor like morning mist. But they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned, their ancient fortifications no match for the concentrated firepower of Vernon's fleet. The British guns systematically reduced the Spanish defenses to rubble, their heavy shot crashing through stone walls that had once seemed impregnable. The Spanish artillery pieces, many of them bronze cannons cast in Spanish foundries decades earlier, answered the British fire with defiant roars, but the garrison's ammunition supplies were limited, and their guns were increasingly silenced by direct hits from British ships. The psychological effect of the British bombardment was as devastating as its physical impact, as the constant noise and destruction wore down the defenders' morale and made coordinated resistance increasingly difficult. By the afternoon of the 22nd, after more than 36 hours of continuous bombardment, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Spanish fortifications lay in ruins, their guns dismounted, and their walls breached in multiple places. The Spanish garrison, having exhausted their ammunition and suffered heavy casualties, was forced to acknowledge that further resistance would only result in unnecessary loss of life. The surrender of Portobello was conducted with the military courtesy that characterized 18th century warfare between European powers. Spanish officers met with their British counterparts under flags of truce to negotiate terms that would allow the garrison to surrender with honor, while protecting the civilian population from the excesses that often followed such victories. The British victory was complete, and by the standards of 18th century warfare, relatively swift. Vernon's men occupied the city with the disciplined efficiency of professional soldiers, their officers maintaining strict control to prevent the kind of looting and violence that had characterized some previous British victories in colonial theaters. The admiral understood that treating the Spanish population with respect would serve British interests better than allowing his men to indulge in the traditional spoils of war. The strategic value of capturing Portobello extended far beyond the immediate military advantages it provided. The city's warehouses contained valuable goods that could be seized as prizes of war, while its harbour facilities could serve as a base for future British operations against other Spanish strongholds. More importantly, the psychological impact of the victory demonstrated to Spanish colonial populations that British naval power could reach any corner of the Caribbean. The news of Portobello's fall reached London in January 1740, carried by fast ships that had raced across the Atlantic to bring word of British triumph to a nation hungry for validation of its decision to go to war. The reaction was immediate and euphoric, with celebrations breaking out in cities and towns across Britain, as citizens felt their confidence in national greatness vindicated by military success. Here, at last, was concrete proof that the decision to go to war over Jenkins Ear had been justified. The opposition politicians who had pushed for conflict claimed victory, their arguments about Spanish weakness apparently confirmed by Vernon's swift success. Even Walpole's supporters, who had opposed the war from the beginning, had to acknowledge that the campaign had begun brilliantly, and that British arms had upheld national honour in spectacular fashion. Vernon became an overnight hero, his name celebrated in songs and ballads that spread throughout the British Isles with remarkable speed. Popular culture embraced the admiral as the embodiment of British naval supremacy, with his portrait appearing in countless engravings that depicted him as a modern Nelson, the saviour of British commerce and national pride. Medals were struck in his honour, while street ballads recounted his exploits in language that transformed military action into national myth. The capture of Portobello was seen as proof that Spanish power in the Caribbean was merely a facade, ready to crumble at the first serious challenge from British determination and superior seamanship. Popular opinion concluded that the Spanish Empire, weakened by decades of decline and corruption, could not stand against British vigour and technological superiority. But the euphoria in London masked the harsh realities of Caribbean warfare that would soon become apparent to British forces operating in the tropical environment. Portobello, while symbolically important and strategically valuable, was ultimately a peripheral target in the broader context of Spanish colonial defence. The real test of British resolve would come when Vernon attempted to strike at more significant Spanish strongholds, defended by larger garrisons and protected by more formidable fortifications. The admiral's next target was Cartagena, the greatest Spanish fortress in the Caribbean and the key to their entire defensive system in the region. This massive city, located on the coast of present-day Colombia, was protected by some of the most sophisticated fortifications in the New World, engineering marvels that had been constructed over generations to withstand any assault that enemies might attempt. Cartagena's defenses had been designed by the finest military engineers in the Spanish Empire, men who had studied the latest developments in fortress design and had incorporated lessons learned from successful defenses of other Spanish strongholds. The city's walls, built of coral stone and reinforced with earth, had withstood numerous attacks over the centuries, earning it a reputation as virtually impregnable. The army component was commanded by General Thomas Wentworth, a capable officer with extensive European experience, who nonetheless found himself operating in an environment for which his training had not prepared him. The challenges of coordinating naval and military operations in tropical conditions, managing supply lines across thousands of miles of ocean, and maintaining the health of European troops in Caribbean climate would test his abilities to their limits. The preparations for the assault on Cartagena were far more extensive than those for Portobello, reflecting both the greater importance of the target and the lessons learned from the earlier campaign. Vernon's fleet was reinforced with additional ships of the line and thousands of troops, creating what was at the time the largest expeditionary force in British history. The scale of the preparation demonstrated British determination to achieve a decisive victory that would end Spanish resistance in the Caribbean. The expedition that sailed toward Cartagena in early 1741 represented the flower of British military might, assembled from regiments that had distinguished themselves in European campaigns and equipped with the finest weapons and equipment that British industry could provide. Imagine yourself aboard one of the transport ships, surrounded by soldiers whose red coats had been carefully cleaned and pressed for the campaign ahead, their brass buttons polished to perfection, and their weapons maintained in pristine condition. These men, many of them fresh from the recruiting stations of England and Scotland, carried with them the confidence of a nation that had convinced itself that Spanish resistance would crumble before British determination and superior training. They had been told that they were embarking on a campaign that would bring glory to British arms and rich rewards to those who served with distinction. Lezo's physical disabilities, earned in battles against British, French and Moorish forces throughout his long career, had made him a living symbol of Spanish military determination. His men followed him with fanatical loyalty, knowing that he had shared their dangers and had proven his courage in countless engagements. Under his command, the Spanish garrison prepared for what they knew would be a fight to the death. The siege of Cartagena began in March 1741 and would continue for 2 grueling months, becoming one of the bloodiest and most frustrating campaigns of the entire war. The British forces, despite their overwhelming numerical superiority and technological advantages, found themselves battered by tropical disease, hampered by logistical problems, and frustrated by Spanish defenses that proved far more resilient than intelligence reports had suggested. The Caribbean climate, which had seemed so inviting when viewed from the deck of a ship anchored in pleasant waters, became a deadly enemy that killed more British soldiers than Spanish bullets ever would. Yellow fever swept through the British ranks like wildfire, its victims suffering agonizing deaths that began with seemingly minor symptoms but rapidly progressed to the characteristic yellow skin, black vomit, and organ failure that gave the disease its fearsome reputation. Malaria, dysentery, and other tropical diseases followed in yellow fever's wake, creating a medical catastrophe that overwhelmed the expedition's limited medical resources. The hospitals established on ships offshore overflowed with the sick and dying, their moans and cries carrying across the water to mix with the sound of constant gunfire and create an atmosphere of horror that affected even veteran soldiers' morale. The British assault on the fortress of San Luis de Boca Chica, which guarded the narrow entrance to Cartagena's harbour, succeeded only after weeks of bloody fighting that cost thousands of British lives. The Spanish defenders, many of them colonial militiamen, fighting for their homeland rather than professional soldiers, contested every inch of ground with a ferocity that surprised their enemies and demonstrated the depth of Spanish determination to hold their key Caribbean stronghold. When the fortress finally fell after a siege that had tested British resolve to its limits, its walls were scarred by thousands of cannonballs, its interior choked with the debris of battle, and its defenders buried beneath the rubble of fortifications that had been systematically reduced by British artillery. The victory, while tactically significant, had come at a cost that made many British officers question whether the ultimate objective was worth the price being paid. But the capture of Boca Chica proved to be only the beginning of British troubles, as the main defences of Cartagena remained intact and as formidable as ever. The Spanish population of the city, rather than being demoralized by the fall of the outer fortress, seemed to be inspired to greater resistance by the demonstration of British determination to capture their city. The main defences of Cartagena, protected by massive walls that rose directly from the sea and defended by Lezo's seasoned troops, remained unbreached despite weeks of bombardment. The British forces, already weakened by disease and exhaustion, found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, as Spanish reinforcements arrived from the interior, and as the defenders adapted their tactics to counter British advantages. The final assault on Cartagena's walls came in April 1741, launched by British forces, whose numbers had been decimated by tropical disease, but whose commanders felt compelled to attempt a decisive action before their army completely disintegrated. The attack was repulsed with heavy losses, the Spanish defenders fighting with the desperation of men who knew that defeat would mean the destruction of everything they held dear. Spanish artillery, much of it positioned on the city's walls where it could fire down on attacking forces, took a terrible toll on British assault columns. The narrow approaches to the city's defences became killing grounds where British soldiers fell in heaps, their blood staining the coral sand while their officers struggled to maintain order in the face of devastating defensive fire. Vernon's withdrawal from Cartagena was conducted with the professionalism that had characterized his earlier victories, but it could not disguise the magnitude of the defeat or its implications for British hopes of quick victory in the Caribbean. The expedition that had set out with such high hopes returned to Jamaica with its ranks decimated by disease and its reputation for invincibility shattered. The Spanish defenders, led by the indomitable Lezo, had proven that British naval supremacy was not enough to guarantee victory against a determined enemy, fighting on familiar ground with every advantage that climate and terrain could provide. The lesson would be repeated in subsequent British operations throughout the Caribbean, as Spanish colonial forces demonstrated unexpected resilience and fighting ability. The war continued for several more years, but the pattern established at Cartagena would repeat itself again and again throughout the Caribbean theatre. British forces would win tactical victories at sea, capturing isolated Spanish outposts and disrupting colonial trade, only to find themselves frustrated by Spanish resilience on land and decimated by diseases for which they had no effective treatment. The Caribbean became a graveyard for British ambitions, its tropical waters claiming more lives than any battlefield in Europe had ever seen. The irony was not lost on surviving veterans that more British soldiers died from fever and flux than from enemy action, their bodies buried in unmarked graves far from the homes they would never see again. The human cost of the war was staggering by any measure. Thousands of British soldiers and sailors died, not in glorious battle but from the diseases that flourished in the Caribbean climate. Yellow fever, malaria, and dysentery proved to be more deadly enemies than Spanish guns, their victims often dying in agony aboard overcrowded hospital ships, where medical knowledge was powerless against tropical diseases. The families of the dead received little compensation for their losses, while the survivors who eventually returned to Britain bore the physical and psychological scars of campaigns that had tested human endurance beyond its limits. Many veterans of the Caribbean campaigns would spend the rest of their lives struggling with the effects of tropical diseases that continued to claim lives long after the shooting had stopped. The gentle trade winds that had once carried Spanish treasure ships across the Caribbean now carried the stench of death and the smoke of burning cities, transforming a tropical paradise into a theatre of human misery. The war that had begun with such promise and such confidence in British superiority had become a brutal contest of endurance, testing the resolve of both empires in ways that no politician in London or Madrid had anticipated. As the conflict dragged on through years of inconclusive campaigning, the original cause, Jenkins' severed ear, seemed increasingly remote from the realities of Caribbean warfare. The personal injury that had ignited public outrage in Britain had been transformed into a struggle for imperial dominance, with consequences that would reshape the balance of power in the New World for generations to come. The war had revealed the limitations of British power as clearly as it had demonstrated British determination, showing that naval supremacy alone could not guarantee victory in colonial warfare, and that the costs of empire could be measured not only in gold but in the lives of those who fought to extend and maintain it. The ear that had started the conflict had become a symbol, not of easy victory but of the complex realities of imperial competition, in an age when the stakes were measured in human suffering as well as national glory. Chapter 4. From Ear to Empire. The war that had begun with such clarity of purpose in 1739 gradually transformed into something far more complex and ambiguous. By 1742, the conflict that bore Jenkins' name had become entangled with the broader European struggle known as the War of Austrian Succession, a vast continental conflict that would rage for 8 years and involve most of the major powers of Europe. The severed ear that had once galvanized British public opinion now seemed like a distant memory, overshadowed by the grand strategies and shifting alliances that characterized 18th century warfare. Imagine yourself in the map rooms of European capitals during these years, where ministers and generals moved colored pins across charts of the Atlantic world, each movement representing the deployment of thousands of men to distant battlefields. The Caribbean, once the primary theater of operations, had become merely one front in a global conflict that stretched from the forests of North America to the battlefields of Central Europe. The human cost of this expanded war was staggering, though the full extent would only become clear with the passage of time. In the Caribbean alone, British forces suffered casualties that dwarfed those of any previous conflict. The official records, meticulously maintained by military bureaucrats, tell only part of the story. They speak of regiments reduced to mere companies, of ships that limped back to port with crews decimated by disease, of expeditions that simply vanished into the tropical vastness of the New World. The reality behind these dry statistics was far more harrowing. Consider the fate of the men who had sailed from Britain with such high hopes in 1741, convinced that Spanish resistance would crumble before British determination. Those who survived the siege of Cartagena returned home as shadows of their former selves, their bodies ravaged by tropical diseases, their minds haunted by memories of friends and comrades who had died far from home. The letters that reached British families during these years, painted a picture of suffering that contrasted sharply with the heroic narratives promoted by government propaganda. "The fever has taken Tom," wrote one sergeant to his brother in Yorkshire. "He passed quietly in the night, calling for mother. The heat here is beyond description, and the smell of death hangs over everything." Such personal testimonies, circulated through informal networks of family and friends, gradually eroded the public enthusiasm that had initially greeted the war. The Spanish experience of the conflict was equally devastating, though it was characterized by a different kind of suffering. Spanish colonial societies, already stretched thin by the demands of governing vast territories with limited resources, found themselves forced to mobilize every available man for the defense of their cities and trade routes. The siege of Cartagena, while ultimately successful, had cost the Spanish dearly in both material and human terms. Don Blas de Lezo, the heroic defender of Cartagena, had died shortly after his victory, his body finally succumbing to the accumulated wounds of a lifetime of service. His death came to symbolize the price that Spanish America had paid for its survival, a reminder that victory in the Caribbean had been purchased with the blood of men who had given everything for their king and their faith. The war's expansion into Europe brought new dimensions of complexity to what had begun as a colonial dispute. France, Spain's ally through the Family Compact, found itself drawn into the conflict, transforming what had been a bilateral struggle into a general European war. The British, meanwhile, discovered that their naval supremacy in the Caribbean meant little when French armies were threatening their allies in Germany and the Low Countries. The diplomatic machinations that accompanied this transformation were Byzantine in their complexity. In the salons of Versailles and the coffee houses of London, secret agents and unofficial envoys wove webs of intrigue that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. The Earl of Sandwich, Britain's envoy to the Dutch Republic, found himself juggling the competing demands of half a dozen different allies, each with their own agenda and their own price for continued cooperation. The financial burden of maintaining such a vast coalition proved almost unbearable. Britain, despite its growing commercial prosperity, struggled to fund simultaneous campaigns in the Caribbean, North America, and Europe. The national debt, already substantial at the war's beginning, swelled to unprecedented levels as Parliament voted subsidy after subsidy to keep foreign armies in the field. The Bank of England, that relatively new institution upon which so much of Britain's economic future depended, found its resources stretched to the breaking point. In Spain, the situation was even more precarious. The Spanish treasury, dependent upon the irregular arrival of silver fleets from America, faced the dual challenge of funding defensive operations in the Americas while contributing to French-led offensives in Europe. The interruption of trade caused by British naval operations meant that the very wealth that was supposed to fund Spain's war effort was being systematically destroyed by enemy action. The French, ostensibly the most powerful military force in Europe, discovered that their traditional strengths on land were of limited value in a conflict that increasingly centered on maritime commerce and colonial possessions. Marshal de Saxe might dominate the battlefields of Flanders, but French merchants watched helplessly as British privateers swept French shipping from the seas and seized French colonial outposts with apparent impunity. By 1743, the original issues that had sparked the conflict had become almost irrelevant to its continuation. British merchants, initially enthusiastic supporters of the war, found themselves burdened by taxes and trade disruptions that far exceeded any benefits they might have gained from victories over Spain. The Spanish, meanwhile, had proven that their empire was far more resilient than British politicians had assumed, capable of absorbing enormous punishment while maintaining its essential structure. The stories of individual participants in the conflict reveal the human dimension of what historians too often reduce to abstract discussions of strategy and diplomacy. Lieutenant James Morrison of the 43rd Regiment of Foot had embarked for the Caribbean in 1740 as an ambitious young officer, dreaming of rapid promotion and colonial wealth. His journal, discovered centuries later in a Devon farmhouse, provides a harrowing account of the disintegration of British military power in the face of tropical disease and Spanish resistance. Morrison's first entries are filled with the confidence of youth and empire. He describes the magnificent sight of Admiral Vernon's fleet as it approached the Spanish Main, the forest of masts and billowing canvas that seemed to embody British naval supremacy. His enthusiasm is palpable as he writes of the easy capture of Porto Bello, the Spanish fortress that fell with such surprising swiftness that it seemed to confirm all British prejudices about Spanish weakness and decadence. But as the months passed, Morrison's tone grew increasingly somber. The tropical heat that had seemed merely uncomfortable in Portobello became a deadly enemy during the approach to Cartagena. The yellow fever that decimated his regiment transformed proud soldiers into shuffling invalids. His final entries, written in an increasingly shaky hand, speak of a military force that had simply dissolved in the face of an environment for which European warfare had provided no preparation. "We are dying faster than the Spanish can kill us," Morrison wrote in what may have been his final entry. "The men speak of home now, as they once spoke of victory. I fear we have sailed beyond the reach of British power into a realm where different laws apply." His body was found weeks later by Spanish forces, clutching a miniature portrait of a young woman whose identity remains unknown. Harrison's letters to his wife in Portsmouth provide a window into the psychological toll of prolonged tropical service. Initially full of professional optimism and domestic affection, they gradually reveal a man struggling with the moral complexities of a war that seemed to have no clear purpose or achievable end. "We fight not for king and country," he wrote in 1744, "but for the ghosts of policies that made sense only in London drawing rooms." Similar stories played out across the Caribbean theatre. Captain William Harrison of HMS Invincible had joined the Navy as a boy, rising through the ranks during the long peace that followed the War of Spanish Succession. His ship, despite its martial name, proved all too vincible when confronted with the reality of Caribbean warfare. Tropical storms that could arise with terrifying suddenness, Spanish fire ships that turned harbors into infernos, and the constant attrition of disease and accident reduced even the finest vessels to floating coffins. The perspective from the Spanish colonies themselves adds another layer of complexity to our understanding of the conflict. Don Francisco de Montemayor, a wealthy merchant and plantation owner in Havana, kept detailed records of how the war affected civilian life in Spanish America. His correspondence with business partners in Seville provides a unique view of how the conflict disrupted the intricate commercial networks that bound the Spanish Empire together. Montemayor's letters reveal how the British blockade gradually strangled Cuban commerce, cutting off not only luxury goods from Europe, but also essential supplies of tools, medicines and manufactured goods, upon which colonial society depended. The price of everything from iron nails to Spanish wine increased dramatically, while traditional export crops rotted in warehouses for lack of ships to carry them to European markets. The social tensions created by these economic disruptions were particularly acute in a society already divided along racial and class lines. Montemayor writes with evident concern about the growing restlessness among the free-colored population of Havana, many of whom had lost their livelihoods as maritime trade collapsed. The enslaved population, always carefully watched for signs of discontent, showed increasing signs of awareness that the war had weakened the normal structures of colonial authority. "The British believe they fight only Spain," Montemayor observed in a letter written during the height of the conflict, "but they wage war against an entire world. Every slave who sees Spanish ships burning in our harbor, every merchant who watches his fortune dissolve, every priest who ministers to families destroyed by this conflict, all are combatants in a struggle they did not choose and do not understand." The indigenous communities of the Caribbean, already marginalized by centuries of European colonization, found themselves in an even more precarious position during the war years. The Taino and Caribbee peoples who had survived the initial conquest now faced new pressures as both Spanish and British forces sought to exploit their knowledge of local geography and their labor for military purposes. Maria Cacique, a Taino leader from Puerto Rico, whose testimony was recorded by Spanish missionaries, provides a rare indigenous perspective on the conflict. She describes how her people were forced to choose between competing European powers, neither of which offered any genuine protection for native interests. "The British promise us freedom from Spanish oppression," she told the missionaries, while the Spanish warn us of British heresy. "But we have learned that European promises are like morning mist, beautiful from a distance but impossible to grasp." The War of Jenkins Ear marked a significant evolution in the relationship between commerce and military power. Unlike previous conflicts, which had been primarily dynastic or religious in nature, this war was fought explicitly over commercial privileges and trading rights. The financial mechanisms developed to fund such an extensive and prolonged conflict would have lasting implications for both British and Spanish imperial development. The British innovations in war finance during this period laid the groundwork for what would later become the fiscal military state that dominated European politics for the next century. The sophisticated system of government borrowing, backed by parliamentary guarantees and serviced by customs revenues, allowed Britain to sustain military expenditures far beyond its immediate means. The South Sea Company, despite the scandal that had nearly destroyed it 2 decades earlier, found new life as a vehicle for government borrowing and military contracting. Robert Walpole, the British Prime Minister who had initially opposed the war, found himself presiding over a financial revolution that transformed the relationship between government and private capital. The merchant classes who had clamored for war against Spain discovered that the conflict offered unprecedented opportunities for profit, even as it imposed new forms of taxation and regulation upon their activities. The Spanish response to these financial innovations was less successful, but equally significant. Unable to match British borrowing capacity, the Spanish crown was forced to rely increasingly upon emergency measures that undermined the long-term stability of the colonial economy. The repeated devaluation of colonial currency, the forced loans imposed upon colonial merchants, and the systematic exploitation of church wealth all contributed to a financial crisis that would persist long after the war's end. The French found themselves caught between these two models, possessing neither British commercial flexibility nor Spanish colonial wealth. The costs of supporting Spanish resistance while simultaneously fighting in Europe strained French finances to the breaking point, contributing to the fiscal crisis that would eventually culminate in the Revolution of 1789. The War of Jenkins Ear was also notable for the technological innovations it produced, particularly in naval warfare and tropical medicine. The challenges of maintaining European-style military forces in Caribbean conditions forced both sides to develop new techniques and technologies that would influence military practice for generations. British naval commanders, confronted with the rapid deterioration of ships and equipment in tropical conditions, pioneered new methods of ship maintenance and crew health that would prove invaluable during later conflicts. The use of copper sheathing to protect ship hulls from tropical marine borers, the development of improved ventilation systems to reduce disease transmission, and the systematic study of tropical diseases all emerged from the harsh realities of Caribbean warfare. Admiral Vernon himself, despite his ultimate failure at Cartagena, made significant contributions to naval medicine and logistics. His insistence on strict sanitary measures aboard ship, his experiments with different dietary regimens for sailors, and his detailed recording of disease patterns in tropical conditions provided valuable data for future expeditions. The Spanish, forced to defend vast territories with limited resources, developed sophisticated early warning systems and rapid response capabilities that maximized their defensive effectiveness. The use of indigenous scouts, the construction of concealed supply depots, and the coordination of military and civilian resources all represented innovations in defensive warfare that would influence Spanish colonial policy for decades. Spanish military engineers also made significant advances in tropical fortification design during the conflict. The modifications made to existing fortifications at Cartagena, Havana, and other major ports incorporated lessons learned from British siege techniques, while adapting European military architecture to Caribbean conditions. The peace negotiations that began in earnest in 1746 reflected this new reality of mutual exhaustion. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, signed in 1748, was a document that revealed the limits of military power and the ultimate futility of attempting to resolve complex commercial disputes through armed force. Neither Britain nor Spain had achieved their original objectives, and both empires had paid a price that far exceeded any rational calculation of potential gains. The terms of the peace were telling in their moderation. Britain retained some trading privileges in Spanish America, but these were far short of the commercial dominance that many had hoped the war would secure. The much-vaunted asiento, the contract to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies, was modified rather than expanded, and even these limited concessions came with restrictions that significantly reduced their practical value. Spain, for its part, maintained the integrity of its colonial empire, though at the cost of nearly a decade of devastating warfare. The Spanish colonial system had proven more resilient than its critics had assumed, but the strain of the conflict had revealed fundamental weaknesses that would continue to plague Spanish imperial governance. The status quo ante bellum had been essentially restored, making the entire conflict seem like a tragic waste of human life and national resources. The diplomatic correspondence surrounding the peace negotiations reveals the complex calculations that ultimately brought the war to an end. Lord Sandwich, representing British interests, found himself arguing for terms that bore little resemblance to the grandiose objectives that had originally justified the conflict. "We must be content with modest gains," he wrote to the Duke of Newcastle, "for the alternative is the complete exhaustion of the realm." The Spanish negotiators, led by the experienced diplomat Don Ricardo Wall, approached the talks with a mixture of relief and caution. Spain had survived the British onslaught, but the cost had been enormous, and there was little appetite for continuing a conflict that had already consumed so much blood and treasure. "Peace with honor," Wall wrote to his superiors in Madrid, "is preferable to victory with bankruptcy." Captain Jenkins himself had long since faded from public consciousness by the time peace was declared. The man whose mutilated ear had provided the spark for such a vast conflagration had returned to obscurity, his moment of historical significance reduced to a footnote in the larger story of imperial rivalry. His preserved ear, once the most famous political artifact in Britain, had been relegated to memory, its power to move men to action exhausted by the very conflict it had helped to create. Research into Jenkins' later life reveals a man struggling to reconcile his brief moment of fame with the reality of an ordinary existence. After his appearance before Parliament in 1738, Jenkins had returned to his maritime career, commanding merchant vessels in the increasingly dangerous waters of the Caribbean. His ship's logs from the war years, preserved in the archives of Lloyd's of London, show a competent but unremarkable captain, careful to avoid the Spanish patrols that had made his name notorious. Jenkins' personal correspondence during the war years reveals a complex attitude toward the conflict that bore his name. In letters to his sister in Bristol, he expresses both pride in his role in awakening British resolve and unease at the scale of suffering that had resulted from his testimony. "I spoke only truth before the gentlemen in Parliament," he wrote in 1743, "but I never imagined that truth would purchase so much sorrow." The irony was not lost on contemporary observers. The war that had begun with such a personal and visceral symbol of Spanish cruelty had evolved into an abstract struggle over trade routes and colonial boundaries. The ear that had once embodied British humiliation had been transformed into a mere historical curiosity, its political potency dissipated by the passage of time and the accumulated weight of more immediate concerns. Historians would later debate the true significance of the War of Jenkins Ear, with some arguing that it represented a crucial turning point in the balance of imperial power, while others dismissed it as a costly distraction from more pressing European concerns. What cannot be disputed is the human cost of the conflict, measured not only in the thousands who died in battle or from disease, but in the broader social and economic disruption that accompanied 8 years of warfare. The most perceptive contemporary analysis of the war's significance came from David Hume, the Scottish philosopher and historian, who observed that the conflict revealed fundamental contradictions in the nature of commercial empire. "A nation may possess the most formidable navy," Hume wrote, "and yet find itself unable to impose its will upon territories whose very distance renders them almost independent of European control." The Caribbean itself bore the deepest scars of the conflict. Islands that had once prospered from trade now lay in ruins, their populations decimated by warfare and disease. The delicate ecological balance of the region had been disrupted by the massive military operations, while the social fabric of colonial society had been strained to the breaking point by the demands of total war. Modern environmental historians have begun to appreciate the ecological dimension of the War of Jenkins Ear, recognizing it as one of the first conflicts in which European military operations caused significant and lasting environmental damage in tropical regions. The massive earthworks constructed during the siege of Cartagena, the deforestation caused by the need for ship timber and fortifications, and the disruption of agricultural patterns all had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military situation. The demographic impact of the war was equally profound. Recent research suggests that the combined effects of warfare, disease, and economic disruption may have reduced the population of the Caribbean by as much as 15% during the conflict years. The loss was particularly severe among indigenous and mixed-race populations, who lacked both the political protection and the economic resources to weather the crisis. The enslaved African populations of the Caribbean endured their own particular form of suffering during the war years. Plantation owners, desperate for labor and security, imposed even harsher conditions on their workers, while the constant threat of invasion and siege made normal life impossible. Some enslaved people seized the opportunity presented by the chaos of war to escape their bondage, but for most, the conflict brought only additional hardship and uncertainty. The merchants and planters who had initially supported the war found themselves counting the cost of their enthusiasm. Trade routes that had once generated steady profits had been disrupted by naval warfare, while the taxes imposed to fund the military effort had eaten into whatever gains might have been achieved. The promise of expanded markets and increased prosperity had given way to the reality of economic stagnation and financial strain. The London merchant community, which had been among the most vocal supporters of aggressive action against Spain, found itself divided by the war's outcome. The great trading houses that had invested heavily in Caribbean ventures saw their fortunes fluctuate wildly with the changing military situation, while smaller merchants were often driven out of business entirely by the disruption of normal commercial patterns. The insurance industry, still in its relative infancy, was transformed by the challenges of covering Caribbean trade during wartime. Lloyd's of London, the informal association of maritime insurers that would later become the world's most important insurance market, developed new techniques for assessing and managing risk that would have lasting implications for global commerce. The social changes produced by the war were equally significant. The prolonged absence of so many men on military service disrupted traditional patterns of family and community life throughout Britain. The widows and orphans left behind by the conflict created new demands upon both public and private charity, while the disabled veterans who returned home required forms of support that existing institutions were ill-equipped to provide. The naval officers, who had dreamed of glory and prize money, discovered that Caribbean warfare offered little of either. The tropical climate that had seemed so exotic from the comfort of English drawing rooms proved to be a deadly enemy, claiming more lives than Spanish cannons ever would. The survivors returned home with stories of suffering and endurance, rather than tales of heroic victory. Many of these veterans found themselves struggling to readjust to civilian life, carrying with them the physical and psychological scars of tropical warfare. The concept of what would later be termed tropical neurasthenia began to emerge in medical literature, as physicians attempted to understand and treat the peculiar forms of mental distress that seemed to afflict veterans of Caribbean service. As the 1740s drew to a close, the War of Jenkins Ear had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing personal grievances to escalate into international conflicts. The ear that had once symbolized British determination to defend its subjects had been transformed into a reminder of the limits of military power and the tragic consequences of imperial hubris. The literary and artistic production, inspired by the war, reveals the complex ways in which British society attempted to process and understand the conflict's meaning. The heroic poetry that had celebrated British naval supremacy in the early years of the war gave way to more somber reflections on the costs of imperial ambition. Samuel Johnson, then a young and struggling writer, captured the changing mood in his poem London, which used the war as a symbol of political corruption and national decline. Here malice, rapine, accident, conspire. The war also influenced the development of British historical writing, contributing to a growing awareness of the complexity and interconnectedness of global politics. Writers like Tobias Smollett, who had served as a naval surgeon during the Caribbean campaigns, brought personal experience to their historical accounts, creating a new genre of military memoir that combined factual reporting with literary artistry. The peace that settled over the Caribbean in 1748 was not the peace of victory, but the peace of exhaustion. Both empires had survived the conflict, but neither had achieved the decisive advantage that their leaders had originally sought. The trade routes remained contested, the colonial boundaries remained fluid, and the underlying tensions that had produced the war remained unresolved. In the quiet years that followed, as the Caribbean slowly recovered from the devastation of war, the story of Jenkins Ear took on an almost mythical quality. The personal injury that had sparked such a vast conflagration became a symbol of the unpredictable nature of history, a reminder that the smallest incidents could have the largest consequences. The captain's preserved ear, wherever it might have ended up, had achieved a kind of immortality through the conflict it had helped to create, not as a symbol of British triumph, as its original champions had hoped, but as a testament to the tragic absurdity of human conflict and the price paid by ordinary people for the grand ambitions of their leaders. The diplomatic lessons learned during the war would influence European statecraft for generations. The recognition that commercial disputes could not be resolved through military force alone led to the development of more sophisticated mechanisms for international arbitration and negotiation. The concept of the balance of power, while not new, was refined and systematized in ways that would shape European politics until the French Revolutionary Wars. The military innovations developed during the conflict had even longer-lasting effects. The techniques of tropical warfare pioneered in the Caribbean would be applied in later conflicts throughout the colonial world, while the administrative systems developed to manage such extensive overseas operations provided models for subsequent imperial expansion. The gentle trade winds that had once carried Spanish treasure ships across the Caribbean now carried the memory of all those who had died in the war that bore Jenkins' name. The tropical waters that had witnessed so much suffering gradually healed, their surfaces unmarked by the battles that had raged beneath them, but the human cost of the conflict would be remembered long after the political issues that had caused it had been forgotten. In the English countryside, parish churches began to accumulate memorials to men who had died in distant Caribbean waters. These modest monuments, often bearing only the simplest inscriptions, bore witness to the human cost of imperial ambition. Sacred to the memory of Thomas Whitfield, aged 19, who died in the service of his king in the Indies, reads one such memorial in a Gloucestershire church, typical of hundreds of similar commemorations scattered across Britain. The Spanish Empire developed its own forms of commemoration, celebrating the successful defense of key cities while quietly mourning the enormous cost of survival. The churches of Cartagena and Havana, filled with votive offerings from families grateful for deliverance, while the records of military service preserved the names of those who had given their lives for king and faith. In the end, the War of Jenkins Ear stands as a reminder that history is shaped not only by the grand strategies of statesmen and the movements of armies, but by the accumulation of individual tragedies and personal losses that give meaning to the abstract concept of human conflict. The ear that had started it all had become a symbol not of British power, but of the fragility of human flesh and the terrible price of imperial pride. The conflict's ultimate legacy lay not in the territorial gains or commercial advantages it had secured, for these proved largely illusory, but in the lessons it taught about the limits of military force and the true costs of empire. In an age increasingly dominated by commercial considerations and imperial competition, the War of Jenkins Ear served as an early warning of the human price that would be paid for European expansion into the wider world. As the winds of change began to stir new conflicts in the following decades, the memory of Jenkins Ear would serve as both inspiration and warning, a reminder that personal grievances could spark global conflagrations, but that such conflicts often consumed far more than they created. In the end, the preserved ear of an obscure sea captain had become a symbol not of imperial triumph, but of imperial tragedy, a fitting monument to the complex and often contradictory nature of human ambition in an age of expanding horizons and unlimited possibilities. As we reach the end of our journey through the strange and tragic tale of the War of Jenkins Ear, let us pause to reflect on the distance we have travelled from that moment of violence in the Caribbean waters of 1731 to the exhausted peace of 1748. In the space of a single ear, one small piece of human flesh, we have witnessed the transformation of personal injury into imperial conflict, of individual suffering into national tragedy. The story we have explored tonight speaks to the peculiar nature of historical causation, the way that seemingly insignificant events can cascade into consequences that reshape the world. Captain Jenkins, in preserving his severed ear, created one of history's most unusual political artifacts, a piece of human tissue that would prove more powerful than any diplomatic protest or commercial negotiation in moving nations to war. Yet perhaps the most profound lesson of this tale lies not in its strangeness, but in its ultimate familiarity. The War of Jenkins Ear reminds us that behind every historical conflict lie individual human beings, men and women who suffered and died, for causes that may seem distant or abstract to us today, but which were immediate and vital to them. The thousands who perished in the Caribbean campaigns, the families who mourned their loss, the communities that were disrupted by war, these represent the true cost of the conflict, a cost that far exceeded any possible gain. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you can find comfort in the thought that the violent world of the 18th century, with its casual brutality and imperial ambitions, has given way to our own more peaceful age. The ear that once symbolized Spanish cruelty and British determination now serves as a reminder of how far we have traveled from those darker times, when personal grievances could spark wars that would consume thousands of lives. The gentle rhythm of your breathing, the comfort of your bed, the security of your home, these simple pleasures would have seemed miraculous to the men who fought and died in the Caribbean campaigns of the 1740s. In the safety of your present moment, you can contemplate their suffering with the knowledge that their struggles, however tragic, belong to a world that has passed away. leaving behind only the lessons of history and the hope of a more peaceful future. Rest well, knowing that the conflicts of the past have been resolved, that the empires that once contended for dominance over the Caribbean have long since faded into memory, and that the year that once embodied such terrible consequences now serves only as a reminder of the fragility of human existence and the preciousness of peace. Sleep comes easily when we remember that we are the beneficiaries of all those who came before us, their struggles and sacrifices, having created the world of security and comfort that we now inhabit. The War of Jenkins Ear, for all its strangeness and tragedy, is ultimately a story of human endurance, and its conclusion is the peaceful world in which you now rest, far from the sound of cannons and the cries of battle, surrounded by the gentle quiet of the present moment. Let the memory of Captain Jenkins and his remarkable ear carry you gently into sleep, knowing that their story, like all stories of human conflict, has found its resolution in the peace that now surrounds you. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with the calm waters of a world at rest.